At dinner, my dad said, "All my daughters make me proud, except the failure." I walked out without looking back. But outside, I heard something he never meant for me to know. And everything changed right then. The plates were still warm, the candlelight flickering like it hadn't heard what he just said. My hand trembled around the stem of my wine glass. Nobody spoke, not my sisters, not my mother, not even me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw the mashed potatoes across the room, but instead I stood up, pushed my chair back slowly, and walked out the front door like I'd rehearsed it my whole life. It wasn't the first time he'd made me feel small. But something about the way he said it, so casually between bites of roast beef, made it feel final. Like he was closing the book on me, as if I'd failed one too many times to ever be considered part of his story again. Outside, the air was cold, sharp against my cheeks. I stood on the porch, breathing hard, trying not to cry. That's when I heard him, his voice muffled through the window. He didn't know I was still close enough to hear. "If only she knew the truth," he muttered. If only she knew what? I gave up, I froze. My heart skipped, then pounded so loud I thought he might hear it from inside. What did he mean? What truth? In one sentence, everything shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't just the family disappointment, I was the one person who didn't know something everyone else might have known all along. My dad had always insisted on sitting at the head of the table, like a captain steering a ship. None of us had signed up to board. Every Sunday, like clockwork, we'd gather at my parents' place, each of us bringing a dish and a smile, pretending like everything was fine. But that night, the air felt thicker than usual. The roast beef was overdone, the wine underpoured, and nobody seemed to notice I hadn't said more than 3 words. We were halfway through dinner when he said it. No warning, no pause. Just, "All my daughters make me proud, except the failure." His fork clanked against his plate, like punctuation at the end of a cruel sentence. No one looked at me. Not my sister Rachel, who's got 2 Ivy League kids and a mortgage that makes her smug. Not Denise, who runs a bakery and still manages to look 10 years younger. Just me sitting there with my job that doesn't pay much, my empty apartment, and the quiet knowledge that I've never lived up to what he wanted. I didn't say a word. I just stood up slowly like my body was made of glass and left my napkin folded neatly beside my untouched potatoes. The chair scraped against the floor, the only sound anyone dared to make. Outside, the porch light buzzed and the cool air wrapped around me like an old friend. I felt 12 years old again, the night he didn't show up to my middle school play because Rachel had a piano recital. I'd spent weeks memorizing lines, only to look out into the crowd and see an empty seat where he should have been. But what he said next, the thing he didn't mean for me to hear, hit harder than all the missed birthdays and broken promises combined. If only she knew the truth. He said, low, almost a whisper. If only she knew what I gave up. I leaned closer to the window, my breath catching in my throat. My heart knocked against my ribs. He gave something up? For me? The man I thought had only ever been disappointed in me. Suddenly, there was something else beneath it all. Regret? Guilt? I didn't know what to make of it yet, but one thing was certain. Whatever story I'd been told growing up wasn't the whole truth. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like running away from the pain. I felt like chasing it down. Asterisk growing up, I learned to measure love in glances. My dad's approval came in quick nods to Rachel when she aced a test, or proud smiles for Denise when her brownies won the school bake-off. Me, I was background noise. Not loud enough to be scolded, not bright enough to be praised. Just ... there. I wasn't a bad kid. I kept my grades decent, played the violin until I outgrew the squeaky beginner phase, and helped Mom with dinner when no one else would. But it never seemed to matter. I could win a spelling bee and still be invisible at the dinner table. My name was rarely said without a sigh attached. I remember once, in high school, I brought home a drawing I was proud of, a detailed charcoal sketch of our old dog, Nagi. I'd stayed up past midnight working on the shading. My art teacher had even hung it in the hallway. I showed it to Dad before dinner. He glanced at it, barely looked up from the sports section. "That's nice," he said. Then turned the page. Denise came in 5 minutes later, holding a pie she baked with canned filling. He clapped like it was a miracle of culinary science. By the time I turned 25, I stopped trying to impress him. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need his approval. But that night at dinner, when he called me the failure, something cracked open inside me, not because it was new, but because he'd finally said it out loud. He had put words to what I had always felt but never dared name, what haunted me most wasn't his words, though. It was what came after. That sentence I wasn't supposed to hear. If only she knew what I gave up. I spent the rest of that night wide awake, staring at the ceiling of my tiny apartment, replaying every moment. That might hint at a deeper story. Had he given something up for my sake? Something big enough to explain a lifetime of resentment? But the only memory that came to mind was one I hadn't thought about in years. I was 6. I had the flu. Mom was at work and Dad stayed home with me. He made me toast and sat beside my bed while I dozed. When I woke up, he was humming a soft, slow tune. I remember thinking it was the nicest thing he'd ever done. But when Mom got home, he snapped back into silence. Like kindness was something he couldn't afford to be caught doing. That song, I never heard it again. I never asked him about it either. Now I wonder. What if that moment had meant more than I realized? I kept the letters in a shoebox under my bed. 17 in total, some handwritten, some typed when I was trying to sound braver than I felt. I'd started writing them in my early 20s, right after I moved out. Every few months, when the ache got too loud, I'd write another. None of them ever made it into the mailbox. They weren't angry letters, not most of them anyway. They were hopeful, like maybe if I just found the right words, he'd finally hear me. Understand me. Choose me. One started with, "Dad, do you remember the day we got ice cream and it melted all over the car seat?" I was trying to remind him of something soft between us, something unguarded. Another ended with, "I don't want to be your favorite. I just want to feel like your daughter." I never had the nerve to send them. I always imagined him reading them with that same blank look he used to give when I talked about my job or my art, like he was trying to find a way to exit the conversation without moving his feet. But after that dinner, after that sentence, the letters haunted me differently. What if he'd been carrying a story I never saw? What if I'd been talking into a silence that wasn't as empty as I thought? I went to see my mom the next morning. She was quiet, peeling apples at the kitchen counter like she always did when she didn't want to be asked hard questions. I sat across from her and waited. When I finally asked, "What did Dad give up?" She froze. She didn't look at me right away. Just set the paring knife down slowly, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and said, "He never told you." That sentence hit harder than I expected. Not he never told me because there was nothing to tell, but he never told you, like there was something. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He didn't." She sat down, hands folded like she was in church. "You were around 7, maybe 8. There was an opportunity, a job in another state. It was everything he wanted, more money, more respect. But he turned it down." I blinked. "Why?" Her eyes didn't meet mine. "Because of you." My stomach turned. "Me? You had just been diagnosed," she said softly. "The school said you needed more support, stability, therapy. He didn't want to uproot you." I don't know what stunned me more, that he had made that choice, or that it had never been spoken out loud. But as I sat there in her quiet kitchen, something didn't quite fit. I'd been in therapy, sure, but I didn't remember anything drastic enough to warrant such a sacrifice, and I had a feeling that wasn't the full story. I hadn't been down in the basement in years. It always smelled of damp cardboard and old regrets, the kind of place where forgotten things went to finish fading. But after what my mother said, I needed answers. Real ones, not half memories. Or whispers. I asked if I could pick up a few of my boxes. She nodded too quickly and didn't ask questions. Maybe she sensed I wasn't just after dusty photo albums. The stairs creaked like they remembered me. I found my boxes where I'd left them years ago, labeled in black marker. College, books, winter clothes. But my eyes drifted past them, toward the far wall, to the old storage room with the heavy wooden door. It had always been locked. As kids, we were told it was full of tools and dangerous stuff, but I'd never seen my dad open it once. Now I noticed something new, a dent in the doorframe. The lock, slightly rusted, looked weaker than I remembered. I hesitated, part of me still scared to defy a house rule, even as a grown woman, but something told me the truth. I was chasing was behind that door. I found a screwdriver in the junk drawer by the furnace. It took some forcing, but the lock finally gave with a sharp snap. The door creaked open and I stood there, blinking into the dust-heavy dark dot. It wasn't tools. It was a makeshift storage space, boxes stacked neatly, each labeled in my father's handwriting, but not like the others. These weren't labeled with categories. They were labeled with my name. I pulled down the first box. Inside, my old untuned drawings, the Maggie sketch now wrinkled but preserved. A crumpled flyer from my first gallery show, the one no one in the family came to. Next box, newspaper clippings of local art exhibits I'd participated in. A receipt from the community college where I briefly taught an evening class. A dried corsage from prom. It didn't make sense. He had saved everything. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The man who never came to my shows, who never asked about my job, who called me a failure over pot roast, had been keeping a secret shrine of my life in a locked basement. And then at the bottom of the last box, a photograph. It was a picture of me at 17 in my graduation gown, standing next to him. Only ... My face had been scratched out. Not sloppily, but deliberately, a single thin line drawn with a red pen. I stared at it frozen. What kind of father saves every relic of a daughter's life, but crosses her out in the end? My hands trembled. Suddenly, I wasn't sure if what I'd found was love kept in hiding, or something far more complicated. I couldn't stop staring at the photo. The red line over my face didn't just unsettle me. It rattled something loose in my memory. A pressure like I'd seen it before, or at least something like it. A sensation of being erased without anyone admitting it out loud. I didn't bring up the photo to my mother. Not yet. I needed time to think, in a place that wasn't shadowed by creaking floorboards and old air. So I drove. No destination, just motion. Windows down, late afternoon sun flickering through the trees like it couldn't decide if the day should be warm or cold. Somewhere between the outskirts of town and the old park where we used to feed ducks as kids, I remembered a name. Corinne. It came out of nowhere like a whisper in my mind. Not a family member, not a friend, but familiar. Oddly familiar. Back at home, I dug through an old email account I hadn't checked in years. The one I used back in high school when everything I wrote felt dramatic and urgent. There, buried in a thread titled "Stuff from Mom's Attic," was a single message from Rachel sent over a decade ago. One line caught my eye. "Don't ask Dad about Corinne. Seriously, it's not worth the drama." I stared at the screen. Corinne. The name wasn't said at dinner tables, not in passing conversations, not in fights. Which meant only one thing in our family mattered. I called Denise. If anyone knew the truth and might be willing to spill it after a glass of Chardonnay, it was her. She answered with her usual cheerful lilt. But it faded the moment I brought up the name. There was a pause. Then, Jesus, where'd you hear that? Old email. Why? Who was she? Another pause. I don't know all the details. Okay? Mom would kill me if she knew I was telling you this. But she was a friend of his from work years ago. Way before things got tense with you. A friend? I asked. But the way Denise said it, the way her voice dipped, told me more. She left town. It got ugly. There was yelling. Mom never forgave him, I don't think, and it had something to do with me. I don't know. Maybe you were little. Things got weird for a while. I hung up with more questions than answers. Karen, a mysterious woman no one talked about. A fracture in our family timeline dot back in my apartment. I looked again at the photo. The red line over my face. Was it grief? Was it guilt? Or was I looking at a scar he'd inflicted on himself over something none of us truly understood? I didn't know. Not yet, but I knew who might. I hadn't spoken to Aunt Ruth in nearly 20 years. She was the family misfit, the one who showed up to weddings in loud clothes and left early without saying goodbye. After a falling out with my dad, some vague argument none of us were allowed to mention, she disappeared completely. Like she'd been erased, the same way I was starting to feel. But late one night, just after midnight, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something nudged me to answer. Hello, is this Nora? The voice was raspy, hesitant, like it hadn't been used in a while. Yes, it's Ruth, your aunt. My heart stopped. Ruth? I heard what happened at dinner, she said. Word gets around. Small town and all. I wasn't sure what stunned me more, that she called, or that she somehow knew. Did Mom tell you? No, but Denise did. And I figured it's time you heard a few things, especially if you found the boxes. I didn't ask how she knew about them. I just waited. There's a reason your dad couldn't look you in the eye for most of your life, she said. And it's not what you think. Was it Karen? I asked. Silence, then a sigh. Karen was part of it, yes. But she wasn't the beginning was you. Me? Your dad was a different man before you were born. Ambitious, proud, sharp-tongued but charming. But when you came along, something changed. You were a complicated birth. There were risks, decisions. Your mom almost didn't make it. I swallowed hard. She never told me that. She wouldn't. Your dad blamed himself for what she went through. Blamed you in a way too, not because you did anything wrong, but because loving you scared him. Made him feel weak, vulnerable. That's not the kind of man he knew how to be. That word. Again, blame. It twisted around everything. But Karen? I asked. What was she to him? She was a colleague. They worked together for years. She saw through him. Called him out on things none of us had the guts to say. They got close. Too close. And when she found out what he'd been hiding, his guilt, the way he treated you, she told him she'd leave if he didn't make things right. And he didn't, I guess. Double quotes, no, he didn't. He let her go, just like he let you drift away. There was a long pause. Then Ruth added, he keeps everything, Nora. Every drawing, every certificate, every card you ever gave him. But he doesn't know how to tell you that he was the one who failed. I sat there, phone pressed to my cheek, feeling like someone had just handed me a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere, but was still clearly mine. I hadn't planned to see him again so soon, but after Ruth's call, something kept pulling at me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a need to understand. So I drove back to the house on a Wednesday evening, unsure of what I was going to say. Or if I'd even knock on the door. As I pulled into the driveway, thunder rumbled low in the distance. The sky was already bruising purple, the air thick with that heavy stillness that only comes before a storm. I told myself I'd just drop off. An old tool he'd once lent me, an excuse to ease into the visit. But before I could change my mind, the front door creaked open. He was standing there as if he'd been watching. You coming in or just here to borrow rain? He said, voice rough. Classic dad. Sarcasm as armor. I won't stay long. I replied, but the sky had other plans. Within minutes, the storm broke. Loud, wet, relentless. Sheets of rain slapped the windows, and wind howled like something wild was trying to get in. The power went out around 7:15. We sat in the living room, shadows dancing from the single emergency candle my mom had tucked away in the side drawer. He poured us both a glass of bourbon, slid one across the table. "I didn't touch mine. I know why you came," he said finally, voice low. "Do you?" I asked, not looking at him. He nodded slowly. "Because you heard what I said, at dinner and afterward. And because of what I found," I added. "In the basement," his jaw clenched. "That wasn't meant for you." I let the silence stretch. Then I asked the question I hadn't dared say until now. "Why did you keep everything and still treat me like I didn't matter?" He looked away, then back again. "Because I was afraid." The words came so quietly, I wasn't sure I heard them right. "Afraid of what?" I whispered. "Afraid that if I let myself love you the way I wanted to, I'd lose control. You were fragile at first, and I blame myself for that. For how hard it was on your mother. For the way you looked at me like I was supposed to be something better than I knew I could be." He paused. The thunder cracked close this time. "I thought keeping my distance would protect you, or maybe protect me. I don't even know anymore." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I'd ever heard from him. Then he said something that made my breath catch. "I used to hum to you when you were sick. You don't remember that?" "I do," I said softly. "You stopped." "Because your mother said it made her cry." And just like that, something inside me shifted. Not forgiveness, but the start of reckoning. The storm passed, but I stayed. Not because anything had been resolved, but because silence finally felt like something we could share instead of fear. We didn't talk much the next morning. He made coffee without asking how I took it, but somehow we got it right. Before I left, he handed me a manila envelope sealed with a single piece of tape. "You might want to listen to this," he said. "I recorded it a long time ago, when things were harder than I ever let on. I waited until I was home to open it." Inside was a small USB drive and a note, just 5 words in his splendid script. "For when you're ready, Nora. It took me 3 hours to press play." His voice came through rough, older than I remembered, like it had weathered too many storms before. "Mine, if you're hearing this, I guess it means you stayed long enough to care," he began. "That's more than I deserved." The recording was just under 10 minutes, but in that time, he laid himself bare in a way I never thought possible. He spoke about Karen, how she pushed him to confront the guilt he carried, not just over the job he gave up or the choices he made, but for the way he shut down emotionally when I was born. "Your mother almost didn't make it," he said. "And I blamed you, quietly, unfairly. It was easier than blaming myself." He talked about my childhood, how he watched me from a distance, storing every moment like a man afraid to touch something too fragile. "You were always stronger than I gave you credit for," he said. "And I didn't know how to be proud without feeling like a fraud." Then came the hardest part. When Corinne left, she told me I was a coward, but I was punishing you for being the thing I feared most, someone who needed more love than I knew how to give. She told me one day I'd see what I'd lost, and she was right. He paused on the recording. I could hear his breath catch. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Nora. I just want you to know I never stopped caring. I just didn't know how to show it without making everything worse." When the audio ended, I sat in stunned silence. I had spent years trying to be seen by a man who had been watching all along, from behind fear, regret, and 1,000 things left unsaid. And now, hearing it all, I didn't feel healed, but I didn't feel invisible anymore. I felt like someone who had finally been given a mirror. Not to see herself the way he saw her, but to realize she had always mattered, even if his love had been broken and clumsy. 3 weeks later, I returned for Sunday dinner. The table was set the same as always. Rachel's salad in the green bowl she never replaced. Denise's 2 sweet rolls, my mother fussing with candles that didn't need adjusting. But something was different. He was already seated when I walked in. No smug smile, no grand gesture, just a quiet nod. And somehow, that was enough. I sat down in my usual spot, across from him. No one mentioned the dinner where I walked out. No one dared. The air was careful, like It knew how thin the ice beneath us still was. We ate in near silence. Conversation flickered around me, a story about Rachel's youngest, a joke Denise told that no one quite laughed at, but my father didn't speak to me, and I didn't press him to, until the end when plates were cleared and the kitchen light cast long shadows across the room. He stood, turned to leave, then stopped. I kept everything because I didn't know how to say I was proud. He said without turning around, "But I am." He didn't wait for a response, and I didn't give him one, because sometimes silence says enough. I stayed after everyone left. Helped Mom with the dishes, dried each one like I used to when I was 12, standing beside her trying to be useful. When I finished, I stepped back into the dining room. Empty now. The chair at the head of the table was still warm. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to earn my place there. I wasn't looking for a dramatic ending. No grand reconciliation. No tears. Just this. The knowledge that truth had finally taken its seat at the table, and that maybe, slowly, we could begin again. Not as a family that fixed everything, but as one that finally saw what had been broken. If you've made it this far, it means this story touched you in some way. So don't leave without subscribing. It really helps the channel and keeps me motivated to share more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And which part of this story moved you the most?